guys, hi. Welcome to our second to the last installment in the Food and Farming on a Hot Planet lecture series. Next week I'm going to try to pull together a few themes from the series, but mostly focus on a project that's been my passion project for several years to protect a local farm using a model called community land trust, which has never been done before in Montana, so I'm super excited that we're really close to succeeding, and I'll tell you about that next week. But tonight, I'm really pleased to introduce you to Margiana Peterson-Rockley, who is the newest professor in the Environmental Studies program. She just joined us in January of this year, and she is a political ecologist whose emphasis is on climate equity and agrarian change. She's also interested in adaptation to climate change in working landscapes, land use policy, racial equity, a whole host of issues, that some of which we've touched on, some more than others this semester. But we're really happy to have Margiana join our faculty. She comes from a farm originally, a goat farm in Massachusetts, and she worked for several nonprofits. She also farmed herself for a while, ran a CSA, and she did her doctoral work at UC Berkeley, where she's also done a postdoctoral fellowship, meaning after she got her doctorate, she continued to work there in doing a research project. She's also done a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard. So we are super lucky to have her here in our little town in Montana, and grateful that she was willing to join our faculty. Some of you may have her in class already. I know everybody's really appreciative of her teaching and her approach to education. If you haven't had her yet, if you're an undergrad, if you haven't taken Sustainable Communities, ENST 225, next semester she'll be teaching that, lucky her. It's a big class, but super fun, and I'm sure she'll put her mark on that as well. Without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to Margiana. She's going to tell us about some of her research in Northern California and the climate implications, as well as the sort of social justice aspects related to that. So give her a warm welcome, and we'll turn it over to her.
Well, thank you, Neva, for the kind introduction, and it's fun to see so many familiar faces here. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of a story. So it was a hot June day in 2018, and I was standing in this farmer's field with him, this cattle rancher's field. And we were looking out over these verdant green pastures, due to some really lucky spring rains. And as I plied him with questions about weather and droughts, over an hour into our interview, he stopped me and he said, "I want you to know that I believe in climate change." He told me about the changing weather patterns on his ranch and what he's observed over the last several decades. He described how his ranch had been impacted by longer and more intense droughts, smaller snowpacks that melted earlier, and smoke from wildfires that now routinely burn the dry, dense forests in California and across the western US every summer and fall. And, when I asked about how he responded to these crises, particularly what farm management practices he'd stopped or started using in response, he paused and he said, "It's important that you not tell my neighbors that I believe in climate change." So today I'm going to talk about some of my research. I'm going to be pulling from a few different research projects. I'm first going to give a little bit of an introduction to some of the methods that I use and how I approach this work. And then I'm going to talk about some of my research on the ways that farmers and farm advisors who are charged with supporting farmers are kind of experiencing and responding to climate change and navigating the politics of adaptation on the ground. And then I'm going to talk about how some new land and water use policies that are being implemented in this region, arguably because of climate change, are impacting different farmers disproportionately. So I'm going to start with a little bit about me. So as Neva mentioned, I grew up on a goat farm, and I was homeschooled until I started college. The farm that I grew up on was right on the Massachusetts-Rhode Island border. And access to my own family's land was just an incredible privilege that I've benefited from tremendously. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that the land that I grew up on, that of the Wampanoag people, and the land that I've lived on since are part of our country's ongoing legacy of land dispossession and accumulation that's very racialized. And these dynamics remain really central in our contemporary agri-food system and how it responds to climate change, which is what I study. But they don't have to be inevitable in the future, and I think that's one of the reasons why I really enjoy working in food systems, is because there's a lot of opportunity for positive change. So, in my research, I really try to center community-identified needs to help drive the direction of my research projects. I often use case studies that allow me to see how dynamics evolve over time or compare in different contexts. I employ mixed, primarily ethnographic methods that include semi-structured interviews and participant observations, and these help me understand people's perspectives from their own experiences. And just to note, this photo here is of Daisy Zhong, who was a research assistant with me in California one summer, and here she's taking notes while we're doing an interview on a sheep farm. Livelihood analysis, in which I work with an extended family over a long period of time, helps me see hidden dynamics within the farm household, like shifts in gender roles. Archival research using textual and discourse analysis allows me to trace power relationships, especially in institutional settings. And I also use some quantitative data, like surveys, USDA census data, citation data, we'll see a little bit of that. Downscale climate models, we'll also see a little bit of that. And I'm happy to talk more about methods when we get there if anybody's interested. So to start off, I'm going to share some of my empirical work, from doing this research on the ground in rural agricultural communities. So this is part of my sort of drawing from my dissertation research, which included doing more than 140 in-depth interviews, looking at how farmers and the people who work closely with farmers are perceiving and responding to climate change. So I've worked here in the mid-Klamath River Basin in Siskiyou County, right on the Oregon border in Northern California, since about 2016. And like a lot of rural places across the US, many people in this region have experienced economic marginalization and identify as politically conservative. And it's important to note that this is not the Central Valley of California. Here, agriculture looks actually a lot like it does in Montana, a lot of family scale ranchers and farmers. So, I'm going to start sort of here. These are some quotes from a document that this county, the county government, actually put out as kind of a primer for people who might want to move to this rural place. And I'm going to ask all of you, what do you see in these quotes? Like, what does this make you think of?
Individualism?
Totally, we've got rugged individuals, right? Yeah. What else? Independence, yeah, we've got self-reliance, kind of integrity. Great. What else?
I'm an anti-city perspective.
Totally. We live outside city limits. Yeah, that's great. So this is a place where the local government actively safeguards a particular notion of rural culture. You know, the cultural livelihoods of farming and farmers are still really important. You know, and the county itself wants to actively protect property rights, hard work, you know, what they call the right to be rural, that they have a very particular definition for. So I began working in this region in 2016 as California was experiencing its worst drought in over 1,000 years, which has increased the frequency and intensity of wildfires. And this period, of course, also coincided with political change. The Trump administration, the first Trump administration, tapped into deep hurts and rural and working class discontent, which people often detailed to me as we were harvesting potatoes or baling alfalfa together. And I set out to study climate change in farming systems and came to appreciate a couple really important things. The first is that other crises like market concentration or generational transition are often much more proximate than climate change, which can seem kind of abstract. And the other is that political and ecological changes are inseparable. They're really intertwined. And farmers are already experiencing climate crises, but they're layered with many other challenges. And even though climate change often wasn't a top priority for farmers, many describe recent droughts or wildfires as wake-up calls or turning points in how and even what they farmed. So this is a little bit faint, but if I tell you that you know, the gray line here on the kind of left is, the gray line is observed temperature, and the green line is an average climate simulation that's been run for the past and the future. What can you tell me about what's going on here? So this green line is the climate simulation run backwards and forwards, and that gray line is actual observed temperature. What do you see? Yeah, totally. We see, you know, even in the observed period, and I need to update this because it doesn't go up to the present, but even in the observed period here, we see that there's some, you know, there is a rise, and, you know, we see these lines somewhat mapping onto each other. What else do you see?
Spikes up and down.
Yeah, there's clearly this trend or this signal emerging over time, but there's also a lot of variability, right, in the day-to-day. And many farmers described this weather variability when I asked them about their experiences of climate, saying things like, everything changes when you live on a farm, you get to expect the unexpected. You know, you can imagine that if you're a farmer on the ground, you're experiencing all of these ups and downs, and it can sometimes be hard, you know, when you're told like there's this big trend, you're like, well, I'm used to drastic conditions, right? And, you know, without talking directly about climate change, many farmers did recognize and describe climate signals. So that's the blue line here, that's kind of the average of that noise, like increasing dryness and temperature over time. But they also described, you know, this significant up and down. You know, but for example, this farmer said, we've always had droughts, but this is very different. So really recognizing even amongst that noise of weather variability, this climate signal or trend emerging over time. And farmers, especially in older generations, often described these climate signals in terms of their lived experiences. Landscape features changing or changes in farming routines, or their observations of wildlife and the ecosystem around them. Trends like reduction in snowpack, increasing temperatures, more wildfires and smoke, and windier conditions. But while farmers are identifying and distinguishing between weather variability and climate signals, they rarely expressed belief in anthropogenic climate change. Instead, many described extreme weather in terms of their region's harsh geography that's so drastic all the time. And many farmers described these extremes and how they were becoming more common in terms of ongoing weather cycles, like this cattle rancher who asserted that we're in a drier cycle, and then explained that she knows, quote, what the scientists say, global warming and the ice packs are melting and doomsday is ahead of us, but I don't necessarily buy into that so much. So farmers do perceive these physical risks of climate change, even if they don't use what has been made into a politically polarized term in the US of climate change. And that's what a lot of research to date has focused on, these physical risks of climate change and how people perceive these physical risks, which are thought of as drivers of climate action. The logic here goes that if a farmer is worried about the risks of flooding or drought in the future, maybe they'll change how they manage water now. And then there's some scholars like Meredith Niles at University of Vermont who have identified policy risk perceptions of climate change, which are thought to dissuade climate action. The understanding is, that farmers perceive risks of more environmental regulations if they say that climate change is real and agriculture is one of its drivers. And one key finding from my research is that many farmers also perceive social risks with climate change. And the minority of farmers who did share their belief in anthropogenic climate change really asked for anonymity and assurances, like that farmer I introduced this story with, that I wouldn't tell people in their community. So in a community where climate change disbelief is a strongly held cultural norm and political identity, farmers worried they'd be ostracized if they were associated with climate change. Established farmers were especially worried about losing access to what Lori Young and Jill Belsky, who were and are here at UM, have termed norms of neighborliness. These are the informal norms that people in rural communities, however much the county or even they might assert individualism, these informal norms between community members are incredibly important to rural life. Like the ability to herd your cows across a neighbor's property boundary, or reciprocal labor exchanges. You help me put up hay and I'll help you brand your cattle. And some farmers also worried about being excluded from institutional benefits that come from easy access to institutions like cooperative extension or local USDA offices, or politically powerful farmers groups like the Farm Bureau. But many farmers still recognized that they needed to change how and even what they farmed to maintain their livelihood, even as the contours of their livelihoods changed. This multi-generational rancher echoed a common sentiment by saying, we need to find a better way. Families can no longer make a living just doing cows and hay. We're a dying breed. So even if they're concerned about being associated with climate change or don't believe in anthropogenic climate change, farmers across groups are changing what and how they farm in a variety of ways in response to climate impacts. So nearly every farmer who I interviewed was pursuing in some way this kind of simplifying pathway, often investing in new technologies like efficient pivot irrigation systems. And part of that is because the USDA and other institutions on the ground are really encouraging the adoption of these new technologies. So for example, farmers can participate in cost share programs that help them implement these new infrastructures. But the problem, which a number of farmers pointed out, and is also well represented in the academic literature, is that upgrading to your infrastructure doesn't necessarily mean you use less water. In fact, often when there's support to upgrade your infrastructure, you may actually expand the amount of land you're cultivating on, for example. And you may, at a community-wide scale, end up using more water overall. It's not really addressing the underlying problem of too much water use. And this is one way that this kind of adaptation can be what's called maladaptive. But a lot of farmers said, they kind of recognized that maybe this wasn't actually addressing the root problem, but it was what, as one farmer said, the USDA is funneling money at. Another thing that farmers pointed out is that, really, a lot of times these technologies, especially, for example, crop monitoring softwares, aren't really telling them things that they don't already know. So they might be investing and even going into debt to purchase some of these technologies, but they're not necessarily helping address problems that the farmers themselves are facing. But overall, this simplifying pathway has a tendency, and this is the pathway that agriculture has been on for a long time, has a tendency to increase the scale of production and reduce the diversity of production and lead to these landscapes that are highly homogenized and consolidated. For example, land ownership being consolidated. And this might be a good place to talk a little bit about these institutional actors who are charged with supporting farmers on the ground, like cooperative extension advisors or USDA staff at the Farm Service Agency and Natural Resource Conservation Service. So these are public farm advisors, and they provide farmers with technical assistance, help solving problems, but also with financial assistance like cost-shared programs or low-interest loans. And they're in a really good position to help farmers adapt to climate change, but a lot of research shows that especially in rural areas, they're a little bit falling short of doing this. And there are a few reasons that I want to mention, and I'm sure there are more, but a few sort of points I want to mention. The first is that these agricultural advisors have a high degree of autonomy on the ground. They get to decide what they work on and who they work with. And this presents a real trade-off because on one hand, you want these farm advisors to be able to tailor their programs to specific community needs. But on the other hand, these farm advisors can choose not to work with certain farmers, and they can choose not to work on certain issues like climate change. And the second sort of concern is that these local advisors often share similar beliefs and perceptions about climate change with the most politically powerful farmers in the region. And there's a real tension here too, because on one hand, shared beliefs can be really important and helpful in working with and gaining the trust of farmers. And that's especially important when we're talking about a politically contentious issue like climate change, and we're talking about government employees in places where there might be limited trust in government. But the problem with this is that reflecting the beliefs of the most outspoken farmers can reinforce a narrow set of acceptable norms and practices. For example, those kinds of simplifying practices we were just talking about. And then the third issue is that a lot of existing programming is aimed at trying to educate farmers or change their mind about climate change, trying to convince them basically that climate change is real and human caused. But this approach can backfire and even exacerbate those social risks that farmers perceive related to climate change. And this approach of trying to educate farmers about climate change really falls in this classic knowledge deficit model, which has been critiqued in many contexts for ignoring power relations, sort of setting this opposition between kind of the holders of knowledge. You can kind of see this in the picture maybe with, this is on a mural on the local extension building, someone who's holding that clipboard, who has the answers, who knows the knowledge, and maybe a passive recipient of that knowledge, who's the farmer here. And these knowledge deficit approaches also tend to favor kind of technocratic solutions. And you can see, again, we see the big pivot, we see the expensive tractor in this image. Okay, so that's a little bit about the simplifying side of things, but a lot of farmers are also employing diversifying or ecologically based or agroecological practices like integrating crops and livestock and cover cropping for adaptation benefits, especially increasing water storage capacity in soil. So this pastured hog farmer said simply, well-maintained dirt will see you through the season. But farmers don't get that much public funding or support, which kind of for these kinds of practices, which limits the scale of their adoption. And adaptation practice or adaptation strategies extend beyond farmers' fields to include livelihood strategies too. For some farm families, this meant seeking permanent off-farm work. So there's a well-documented history of farmers temporarily seeking off-farm work to support their livelihoods and their families, especially during moments of crisis or during moments of farm expansion. But here, with the impacts of climate change especially, many farmers described the need to seek permanent off-farm work so that they're not completely reliant on the weather anymore. And sometimes farmers pursue what's called a transformational livelihood adaptation, which is to leave agriculture altogether. And this quote at the bottom, where this rancher told me how his neighbors had experienced, in response to drought, these come to Jesus moments when it was time to leave their bad relationship with farming. So the fact that farmers are adapting irrespective of their beliefs about climate change is really important, especially because a lot of previous research has suggested that belief and action are tightly coupled, even that farmers need to believe in climate change before they take action. And that has led, of course, to these interventions that are really focused on trying to teach farmers about climate change, which just haven't worked very well. Okay, so sort of, maybe I'll just put up this quote here and I'll say, when we're talking about the ways that farmers are navigating the politics, even the sort of micro or everyday politics on the ground of climate adaptation, they're pretty strategically mitigating these perceived social risks. So this is another question for all of you. What do you see in this quote, or how might this farmer be kind of like navigating the social risks they might perceive of climate change?
They're recognizing what's changing, but they're not specifically identifying climate change as the reason.
Totally, yeah. So farmers often don't mention climate change or kind of vague about it, right? This is like for whatever reason. And these are really important strategies in a rural community where you maybe perceive some of these social risks if you talk openly about climate change. But while all farmers are adapting to the impacts of climate change because they have to, there's not an alternative at this point, differently positioned farmers are adapting in different ways. So I found that women farmers were often leading, especially those diversifying adaptation efforts. Women farmers in this region, like in many regions, are often denied parity in access to institutional resources, and many describe stories of being dismissed or not taken seriously by institutional staff at local USDA or cooperative extension offices, and by other farmers and organizations like the Farm Bureau or the Cattlemen's Association. And there's kind of a power in this, sort of assigned powerlessness here, because women farmers in this region are already on the margins or even outsiders of established farmer social groups. And therefore they might perceive fewer social risks and have less to lose by deviating from those established and tightly held onto local norms. They're already not part of the good old boys club, as this farmer told me, so they don't need to follow the rules of that club. And with generational change, more women, especially within multi-generational farming families, are being recognized as farmers, and they're often less burdened by past practices and local norms, and they can adapt in innovative and new ways. Okay, so maybe I'll pause there for a quick second and see if you all have questions so far. Do you want to ask? Yeah.
Like, what were the reactions of farmers when you originally came in? Like, what did you tell them about your research?
It's a great question. So I said that I was really interested in the challenges and opportunities that farmers were experiencing, especially because of droughts and wildfires and other extreme weather events. So I talked about climate change, but I didn't use the term climate change. Anyways, that's one of the ways that I would introduce the work that I was doing. And really, I genuinely wanted to understand what their experiences were like, how these events were impacting their lives and their farms and what they were doing in response. And in the back of my mind, I knew, because the academic literature shows that there's this kind of puzzle where the majority, or more than half of farmers in rural America say that they don't believe in anthropogenic climate change, but they're on the front lines of its impacts. They're already grappling with them. And so I was really interested in how they were navigating that puzzle. Yeah.
In a similar vein to that question, can you think of maybe like a more challenging either interview or like participant observation, whatever like method of research that you've experienced, whether it was because the person you were learning from was like hesitant to like play into the questions, or if it was like more emotionally triggering, like I don't know, challenge is a broad question.
Yeah, well, more than climate change, the fact that I was from UC Berkeley was a challenge. And I remember one interview where like this farmer, this older guy, he was like kind of, really bristly, you could tell he was kind of like, he had a conception of who I was and where I was coming from. And during the whole interview, he kept wagging his finger at me and saying, "Your government, your government's doing this, your government's doing that." And yeah, but then there were some really hard moments. Yeah, there was, and I'm happy to talk about, some of the methods and approaches, but definitely the hardest interview was with another man, and we were, I was out there doing field work by myself, and we were, out of service in a really rural place. And my first question I always asked in my interview guide was really open-ended. It was, "Why do you farm?" Just like let the participant take that where they wanted. And his response to that was, "So I can meet pretty girls." And I felt extremely uncomfortable. And that was a moment when I extracted myself very quickly. And, to try to be polite and move through things. I, asked him like 2 questions, and I said right then, I'm really sorry, but I'm actually late for another appointment with someone else, and they're expecting me. And I, left in about 10 minutes. But there were definitely times like that were very hard. That was maybe the worst, and I actually count myself relatively lucky. Yeah. Any other questions right now? Yeah.
So I'm not sure if you're familiar, but Robin did a presentation to our environmental justice class and talked about like the UJ mapping that he used to work on. I'm just curious if you used any of that within your research.
I'm not that familiar with what that
Environmental
is.
justice mapping kind of technology, or if you like took that into account when you were like choosing who to do this research with.
I'm not familiar with that mapping tool. I don't know that mapping tool, but many aspects of environmental justice are really key to this research, and I think we're going to get maybe where you're going with that question in the next sort of section. And if we don't, or if you want to come back to it, we can do that. But I'm not familiar with the specific tool that Robin used.
I think it's interesting that the person who pointed out the social risks that, or that women experience fewer social risks was a man.
Yeah, well, that quote was an especially illustrative one because I think he framed it, in the good old boys club. But many women talked about that too. And especially younger women, who were part of these multi-generational families talked about being in, what I remember one young woman described as being in this lovely position where she was kind of a member of the community because of her multi-generational roots, but because she was a woman, she felt like she could do something different and maybe wouldn't be judged for it, or wouldn't be. And she also had plenty of stories of feeling excluded and not sort of being able to access some of those resources and benefits of sort of being centrally part of that social network. So many people described that phenomenon. All right, any other questions right now? We'll come back to some of this stuff, but. Okay, so now I'm going to share a little bit about the ways that climate change, especially climate anxieties and resulting policies, are creating opportunities for discretion in land and water use policy enforcement, and how that's exacerbating racial inequities. Let me just get to the right part in my notes here real quick. So within this kind of contemporary political context where climate change has been made into a cultural flashpoint in this country, which I will say it's not in many other countries. That's like kind of a uniquely US phenomenon that climate change is so politicized. I'm particularly interested in how county level governments people, especially people like sheriffs, planning and agricultural commissioners, board of supervisors, shape land and water use policy in a changing climate, and what the equity outcomes of these processes are, especially on racial and ethnic disparities. So I'm going to ask you a kind of random question. Raise your hand if you think that growing cannabis is legal in California. Okay, great. So you all win that quiz. So before we get into this, I do need to provide you a little bit of context, policy context about cannabis. So in 2016, California voters approved Proposition 64, which did legalize commercial cannabis. This is a map of the counties that voted to approve Proposition 64. But built into that law was an exceptionally high degree of local control, which is why it's such a good case to study local control. And one aspect of that law is that localities, cities and counties, could decide whether and, well, how and even if this crop could be grown. And that's not the case for other crops, right? Like you can't have, you can't say no tomatoes in this county, right? Or no corn in this county. But with cannabis, you can do that. So that makes it a really good case to look at some of these issues of local control. And in fact, nearly 70% of cities and counties have banned the cultivation of this crop. So they've said you cannot, in fact, grow it in our jurisdiction. So prior to about 2014, there was really no mention of cannabis in county records, despite talking to multiple white men who had grown medical marijuana in this very libertarian, remember, like those quotes early on that the county put out, this is like individual liberty, self-sufficiency, do what you want on your own private property kind of place. And that had been the way it was for a really long time, including with cannabis. And there were many, many people who we interviewed who had been doing that for decades, no problem. Then, starting in the mid-2010s, suddenly the majority of the county's governing capacity through ordinances and zoning amendments and budget allocations started to focus on this one issue of cannabis cultivation. And this sudden shift in resources and governing to what the county called this out-of-control problem that threatened our way of life of cannabis cultivation coincided with two things. So the first was the passage of Proposition 64, which gave localities this really high degree of local control over this particular crop. And the second was the in-migration to this region of many Asian and Asian American farmers, majority of them Hmong, to Siskiyou County. So starting in about 2014, Hmong farmers began purchasing these small contiguous plots in several large rural subdivisions. And this is what these subdivisions look like. There are 4 of them in the county, and they each have over 1,000 1 to 2 acre plots that were previously mostly unoccupied. And these are not subdivisions. Like when I heard there were subdivisions here, like I had an image in my mind of what a subdivision was, and this was not it. This is what they look like on the ground. These plots are dry, they're often on slopes, they're rocky, and they were cheap. A lot of people talked about buying a 2 acre parcel for $10,000. And they had few homes. Most of the estimated 6,000 Hmong residents who still live here live in campers and RVs that you can see, or in kind of plywood, unpermitted houses. And there are no public services, no paved roads, no water, no sewer, no electricity, making the farmers on this land especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change like drought and wildfires. And many of these early in-migrant Hmong farmers were elders, like Mr. Mua, pictured here, who is one of the community advisors on a current research project. And they were retirees who came to the US as refugees after the US secret war in Laos after the Vietnam War. And many had worked in factories in the St. Paul area and on farms in the Fresno area. And people described wanting to farm, to own land, and to live in community in their retirement. The photos on the right here are from last fall at a community feast that I attended while doing field work. So now we're going to see if this works and if we can get sound to work here. But I'm just going to play this. I think we can play the 5-minute clip. This is just so that you can hear about someone's experience in their own words. I don't know, I'll even see, maybe, would somebody mind seeing if they can get the lights? Just, it's a little hard to see, and then I'll work on the sound. But this is from a life history project that I've been working on this past summer. So this is from this past summer. So I went back to Siskiyou County with a videographer and several community-based research assistants who are Hmong themselves, and we did a series of these life histories where we did these really long interviews with people about their whole sort of life story. And let's see if this will play and if we can get sound to work. And so this is just a short clip about, this is Vince Lee, who you'll meet in a minute, but about his early life.
Is this still a Mormon telephone?
Yes. This is Mount Shasta. Can you guys hear? I think it's
probably about 2 years old. My mother has my other sibling, and then that sibling passed away. And then my mother had the second sibling, but he was not born yet, and then my dad passed away. My dad was government officials in Vietnam, and we did not move into Laos later year because a lot of people that moved early, so they already established everything in Laos. My dad's time is over, but all my older brothers are soldiers to General Vang Pao. When we moved, all my siblings born in Vietnam. I'm the second to the last child, so I was born in Laos. The first six, we have same father, but they are different mother. So they are my half brothers. Mm-hmm. And because their mother passed away for a while, and then my father remarried my mother. That's why me and the younger brother were born. That's why there's a gap. Sometime, maybe this year, this brother need help. Next year, that brother need help. So I just move around. The fightings happened. Everybody split up for survival. Back there, there's no transportation. Everything is by foot. So I know that my other brother live on that mountain somewhere, and the other brother on that mountain somewhere. A lot of my close family die from the fighting, men, women, and children. Before the war broke up or before the extermination started, everybody was told, when people come to ask you, say you don't know, you don't hear, you don't see nothing. And then after that, the extermination started. I remember one of the elder person in our village got killed, and everybody's talking about it. And then the second person I heard was the village next to us, another person get killed. And then after that, they hear all my brothers and all those people that used to be in the military is, we can no longer live in the village. We have to move on. I have 6 siblings still alive at that time, so we have to split up for survival. And we don't know that the new journey going to Thailand is gonna be a good journey. Everybody gonna survive, or everybody gonna end up dying along the way. So we have to split up. 3 of my brothers moving to Thailand first, and then the other 3 of us stay behind in case that they all die and we survive. I was one of the brother that stayed behind. So the other 3 moved into Thailand, and of course some family members, including one of my sister-in-law died along the way. She got shot, died along the way. But most of them survived and they make it to Thailand. So my older brother that I stayed with him until he passed away several years in Fresno, he has to come back to make sure that we are still surviving in the jungle.
So he got to Thailand and then came back?
Then he come back. And he come back, and then because we moved way too far from the Thai and Laos borders. So he decided to take me back to Thailand. But in order to do that, I have to become a soldier because you cannot take the whole family. So I'm the one that is available to come by myself. Mm-hmm. So he put me as a soldier into his team. So I can. It takes about half a year, 6 months to go from Laos and Vietnam border to Thailand and Laos border in order to cross the Mekong River. They have all many groups of people. So when we move this group to that group, and then you stay with them. Of course, they have kids, women, and children, but you have to help them protect the camp. So I do make friends along the way. I remember one particular friend. He's a Laotian, but his sister married to a Hmong guy, so he happened to come in to visit his sister, and then the extermination broke up. So he lost his parents. He doesn't know where they go. So he stayed with the Hmong people in the jungle. And I know him. I remember him pretty well. I still wonder where he is today.
And, you know, he's talking about Thailand, which is where the largest refugee camp, Bon Vinai, was. And so this is after the U.S. secret war, which, I don't know, has anyone even heard of it? Okay, a couple people maybe. But after the war in Vietnam, there was a continued war in Laos where the Hmong, which are an ethnic minority in Laos and Thailand and Vietnam, fought with and on behalf of Americans. And then after the war, they were persecuted. And that was what he was talking about, the extermination. And half of the Hmong population was killed. And now the majority of Hmong people in the world live in the US, the vast majority. Okay, so back in Siskiyou County, where a lot of elders like Vince had come to Siskiyou County to live in community, to live near the mountains that many said reminded them of home, to own land, to farm. Back in Siskiyou County, this new set of potential water users, especially this group marked as culturally and racially different, has been unwelcome by many longtime residents in the area. And in addition to small livestock like these chickens and vegetable garden subsistence crops like here's tomatoes and ginger in the middle, many farmers grow cannabis. And farmers describe growing cannabis to soothe injuries from the war in Laos and also from repetitive work injuries from working in factories and on farms. And people also talked about growing cannabis as a retirement crop. And here I think it's really important to point out that there are few other crops that you could grow on an acre or two of really marginal land and even make enough money to put gas in your car or go buy some groceries. And some people even describe being able to save a little bit, enough to send back to their kids or their grandkids in St. Paul or Fresno to help them afford college. But at the same time that many Hmong farmers moved to this area, the county sort of mounted this new response to this crop. They quickly, right after Proposition 64, banned growing cannabis. The county agricultural commissioner, when I interviewed them, said cannabis, it's not agriculture in any way, shape, or form. They're not real farmers. Really wanting to make this distinction between who, as the county commissioner described, like my ranchers, my farmers, and these newcomers who were denied the actually very politically powerful identity of being a farmer at all. And a lot of the county's efforts and their sort of rhetoric around this new response to cannabis cultivation, which had been happening there for a really long time, was was leveraging environmental concerns and environmental rhetoric. So the local government really emphasized water use, wildfire risk, pesticide contamination, and used those arguments to justify enforcement efforts that targeted this particular population of farmers. And of course, growing any crop, including this one, can cause real environmental concerns. But a lot of research shows that prohibiting something doesn't stop it. It just pushes it further from civil regulation that can monitor and address some of those harms. And the environmental impacts of enforcement, especially law enforcement-led raids, for example, are often underappreciated. So, for example, this image on the right is of a local representative who showed up to sort of triumphantly bulldoze a cannabis grow during a raid. And this is that same site 3 years later. And you can see, often, for these farmers who don't have very much money to clean this up or to rebuild after a raid, and this land doesn't work very much, so often they just leave. And while there's a lot of money for enforcement, there's not any money for environmental remediation. And so, arguably, sites like this pose considerable environmental harm. And that's often what happens after these law enforcement interventions. But despite these bans, despite these really kind of hardline enforcement actions, cannabis cultivation has actually expanded. And these images, show the same area in 2014, 2016, and 2022. And you can see these little dots are the actual plants themselves. And people are growing on a small scale. These are 1 to 2 acre parcels, and people are still mostly growing under the 99 plant limit that would trigger a federal issue. So the county found that this rapidly changing cannabis policy, coupled with environmental and sort of climate anxieties, created opportunities for real innovation in land and water use policy and enforcement. So in November 2017, for example, the county banned camping even on your own private property, which was partly justified by concerns about wildfire risk from having, for example, a generator or a cook stove or a cook fire near a camper. But most of the people who were, camping on their private land were in these subdivisions where most people are living in campers or RVs. And many people have described trying to get building permits to build a house, but never getting them from the county or being sort of put through these cyclical processes that don't get anywhere. And many people have been waiting years to get a building permit to actually build a home. One Hmong resident who was not a farmer pointed out that, quote, white people can live off the grid and it's called sustainable, but when Asian people want to live off the grid, they are labeled as dirty criminals. They judge all of us as marijuana growers. And there's no surface water in the subdivisions, and most of the groundwater is actually contaminated with arsenic. Nearly everyone in the subdivision relies on water trucked in that fills up at nearby deep water wells that alfalfa farmers own. And the picture in the upper left is of water trucks lined up at one of these filling stations on an alfalfa farmer's farm. And the local the local government has really targeted water access as a way, many argue, to make it impossible for these farmers to actually live there, let alone farm there. So in 2021, the county passed a series of water ordinances that banned moving water from one parcel to another, banned the use of groundwater to cultivate cannabis, and then banned transporting water on certain county roads. But what's really wild is they only banned transporting water on the roads directly around the subdivisions where an estimated 75% of residents are Hmong. So for the approximately 6,000 people living here, they suddenly had no water. And one Hmong farmer put it simply saying, without water, we can't live. This water isn't just for growing cannabis, it's for everything, for drinking, bathing, watering pets and livestock, irrigating kitchen gardens. And many people have been driven out. And the photos here are of an unpermitted house that was abandoned after these water ordinances went into effect. And I'll say that while many people have been forced to leave, these efforts haven't actually reduced the amount of cannabis being grown. In fact, the amount of cannabis being grown has increased during this time. And part of that is because you could imagine there's been a lot of consolidation, basically, an increase in scale, as we've seen in other kinds of agriculture. But you can imagine that if you're a farmer, you're worried that this parcel might get hit, you diversify. So you grow on 5 parcels now, so that if one gets raided, you still have more parcels. So that's what we've seen over time, is actually, even though the number of individual people has decreased as some have left, the amount of cannabis being grown has actually increased. And this is just to give you an example of what a citation looks like. And you can see here that often the amounts owed after a raid are enormous. Remember, these are parcels people bought for maybe $10,000. And then they have a fine of $50,000, $100,000, and it's very difficult to ever pay that off, especially for somebody who doesn't have very much money. And although Asian and Pacific Islanders make up just 1.5% of the county's population, we found, looking at the citation data, that over 70% of the fines under these 3 water ordinances from 2021 were against API individuals, and that 88% of the property liens for unpaid fines were against API landowners. And this is just what that data looks like. And the information we have, or the way that we identify racial or ethnic disparity here, is basically the US Census has a tool where you can look up a last name and see what the percent of likelihood that name is a certain demographic. And so this is just showing these are individual citations. I've redacted some information, but you can see the kinds of amounts of money people owe, and that all of these names are a majority, in this case, majority Hmong, but majority API. So it's also really important to note the timing here of the county's actions. 2021 was the year that localities were required to submit their plans for reducing groundwater extraction under California's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And by focusing on estimates of water use for cannabis, then getting rid of the farmers who grow cannabis, the county could meet state groundwater targets without having to curb the water use in the region to grow massive amounts of alfalfa, primarily for export markets, which you can see in this picture on the left being grown in the background here. And just a really quick back of the envelope calculation, the sheriff estimates that cannabis uses, in the height of the growing season, 2 million gallons of water a day, and that alfalfa is using 400 million gallons of water a day. So sort of literal drop in the bucket. And the use of water policy and climate and drought anxieties to target certain farmers really has sparked political protest and pushback. And this is a picture of a protest in 2021 in front of the sheriff's building. And it's also sparked legal action. So in 2021, the ACLU and Asian Law Caucus filed a class action lawsuit against the county government for what many say is a pattern of racially biased water policy enforcement. And this case and many other related cases are still in litigation. And in the meantime, the farmers who I work with here are struggling to survive and build a home. As one older Hmong farmer told us, "My entire life I was born into conflict, searching for a home to make permanent. It is so sad that I'm still driven out from my home. I'm always forced to flee with violence." So stepping back a little bit, I think that this research adds some nuance to what I see as a really important but incomplete conversation about the benefits of giving policy power to local communities. Sometimes local control can seem like a quick fix for complex social and environmental problems, but uncritical calls for local autonomy can end up benefiting the people within a community who are already most advantaged. Okay, so here is where I'm going to wrap up. I guess I have a few sort of concluding thoughts, of course, none of which that I actually wrote down. But, one is that climate change is political, and adaptation and how we respond to climate change is extremely political. And that the politics of adaptation on the ground really matter, and we need to understand them if we're going to be able to increase the pace and scale of climate action, of adaptation and of mitigation. Another is that climate change is creating new opportunities for far-right political formations, especially that leverage climate change anxieties to target certain people. And increasingly, as we see a politics that's us versus them, that's kind of othering, I think it is likely that we will see more of this and that we should pay attention to how these processes work. Another thing is that rurality is never static. There is no the community, and the only thing constant is change. I think that white spaces or rural spaces are often presented or assumed to be white spaces, but that is not the case. No matter what for example, the county government, remember they presented this kind of static notion of what rural culture is, but it's always changing, and the people who live in rural places are also changing. Another important point, I think, is that the way that we adapt to climate change now really shapes our ability to adapt in the future. So thinking back to some of the specific practices that farmers were using, those diversifying practices that build ecological biodiversity into a system really position those systems to adapt in more nimble and flexible ways than that simplifying pathway that can kind of lock agriculture into these inflexible production systems or inflexible or rigid markets. I'm sure there are many more takeaways, and I'm sorry this is not like the most eloquent ending, but those are some of the things that I think are important that I have learned by doing this research and that I think I tried to highlight here. So I'll pause there, end there, and take any questions that you all have.
What is the research that you're doing with cannabis in California? What's your research question there?
So the way that my research has mostly worked so far is one project leads to another. So I'll get to that in one second, but I guess I didn't say this, but the way that I started working on cannabis and with Hmong farmers to begin with is, that picture with the water trucks lined up like in that alfalfa farmer's field. So I was interviewing that alfalfa farmer, and I was like, what are all those trucks there? And he was like, oh, I'll show you, come with me. And he brought me into the subdivision, which is right behind his ranch, and introduced me to some Hmong farmers who had pretty recent, this is 2017, 2018, so it pretty recently moved there. And then I started to know people in that community, and it took a long time to build trust. You can imagine this is a place where people are very vulnerable in sort of every measure of vulnerability, and talking to me is only a risk, and research is not going to help them put in a well or get a housing permit or something that they really need right now. So it took many years of building trust. And then I was able to do, for my postdoc work, a research project that was looking at these issues of local control, and especially the ability to ban a crop and what that meant. And another piece I think that's really interesting about cannabis is that we treat agriculture exceptionally. We have, in our policy landscape, we have this kind of agricultural exceptionalism, where the same environmental and labor regulations that apply to other industries do not apply to agriculture. And we also have learned a lot. People have been doing research on agriculture and, you know, in my world and Neva's world, like the sociology of agriculture, and have understood through that research kind of where we've gone wrong and how we've ended up with this system that is highly unequal, that creates these environmental externalities that are disproportionately borne by many of the people who work in the food system, right? Like the low-wage farm workers who are exposed to pesticides, or people who work in the service industry in restaurants and don't get paid by their employer and have to rely on tips. So we've created this system that we really actually understand very well what's wrong with it. And with cannabis, we have a new crop that we can regulate differently. And I think that's a very exciting opportunity to sort of think through, like, what can we learn? How can we actually take what we've learned in other kinds of agriculture and do it differently with this kind of agriculture? And so that project on kind of the ban and how we regulate cannabis, almost like right after it was first in the light of regulation, was a way that I started to work with, through research, work with some of these Hmong farmers who I'd been building trust with. And then that led to this project that just started this year that is actually now beyond cannabis. It's an agrarian diasporas project. So we're working with Hmong farmers all across the country, contract poultry farmers in Arkansas, cut flower farmers in Washington, bamboo and rice farmers in North Carolina, ginseng farmers in Wisconsin, to really understand how these kind of pockets of production have emerged where Hmong farmers tend to specialize in like very specific crops in different spaces and follow these economic opportunities. And that's what cannabis was, and why people moved, or why they were growing that crop there, because there are, like I said, not many other crops you could grow on an acre or two of land like that.
Not to be that like weird or anything, but like this sounds exhausting. Like doing all this, like how do you like I know like the talking with people usually helps and it usually brings my spirits up, but looking at all these things is like kind of upsetting, and like you like keep pushing through like year after year after year. Like how do you just keep doing it? Like
I feel like I'm so lucky. I'm so lucky to get to do this work. It's an enormous privilege to be in academia and get to think about what I want to think about and talk to who I want to talk to and work on these projects that I hope in some small way can help identify and address the underlying drivers of inequities. Neva mentioned that I farmed and worked in nonprofits, and in many ways that work was very tangible and felt rewarding. I was growing food that people were actually eating, or helping individual farmers find farmland. But it also felt like the same, it's like the same problems over and over again, and I didn't have. For me, that was exhausting. And I think we all find our place to plug in and to do good work. And there's no one way that's better than another. And for me, it's very exciting and energizing to think about the sort of bigger picture structural change and be in this really, really lucky kind of job where I get to do that. Someday maybe there will be more balance. I don't know, I'll do more farming or something as well. But for right now, it is very rewarding to have these long-term relationships and be able to work closely with people on the ground and feel like in some small way, this is how I can use my training and my skill set to support them.
I think your work is so interesting, and I think it really raises these really important questions around sort of the various levels of government. And, such a tension, right? So on the one hand, I'm somebody like, yeah, let's work on things locally, do what we can here. And then I've worked on a number of things in my career where then the state government has come in and undone what we've done. Even here locally, we've got, it sort of seems so innocuous in some ways, but we got a definition of agriculture in the subdivision regulations that actually defined it using the soils.
Wow.
Because the subdivision law says you're supposed to consider agriculture when you approve a subdivision, but they never did it, right? So we pushed to get it defined so that they would have a tool for deciding. Well, the state came in and said, you can't define agriculture by soil, soil type, which is like, it's so ridiculous to me because it seems, so concrete, right? Like, so anyway, but on the other hand, we see issues like abortion right now, where people are saying, let the states decide. I've got this friend who's like, I can't think of a better way than to let the states decide about abortion. It's like, but do you want them to decide about your gun rights? Well, no, we wouldn't want that. So it's, or, we don't want states to decide about civil rights. And so it's just a very interesting issue that you're pointing to, and I'm not really asking a question, except maybe making a comment about that that tension there. Because on the other hand, you could say, well, geez, we live in Montana, so we can make concrete changes in Missoula, But then, anyway, so that's all.
No, I know it's not a question, but I do have two things I want to mention in response. I think one is, something that struck me coming here is the power of this state constitution, which is very unique and provides some of these sort of goals to work towards or uphold, like the right to a clean and healthy environment. And like the protection to privacy, and I think, there's always regulation isn't good or bad, right? It's like, what are the impacts of regulation? And anyway, so that's one point, is like thinking about what are the actual goals and what are the impacts, and those are really the important things. And then the other point is, acknowledging where we are at this moment, whatever, a week and a half after the 2024 election, and to half of you who are in my class, next week we're going to be reading this Loka Ashwood paper where she talks about these different relationships that people have with the state, these kind of pro-state, anti-state, and stateless experiences and perceptions, and I think that we're going to increasingly see that some work has to happen outside the state. And in a sense, and I didn't really talk about this, but within this community where these Hmong farmers, their only interactions with the state have been negative. It's been denying building permits. It's been enforcement first. It's been a police state that they have experienced, not a state of services or support. And they have created services and support. In the subdivision, there is a firefighting team that is extremely well coordinated. There is a lookout team. Everybody who lives in the subdivision has a 1-hour shift a week where they have to sit at the entrance to an entrance to the subdivision and call over signal if a cop comes, and which is seen as a negative thing because people's experiences of the police have been very negative. And they even have an IT team. There are some young guys who go help the elders when their cell phones don't work, there is an intra-community support system that is outside of the state. And I think that there will probably be more examples of that to study in the coming years.
we're out of time, but thank you so much. It's fantastic.
Thank you all.